Thank you for rejoining us back in this room. So get started with our academic panel, we have Dr. Zeinab, Jahed, Dr. Chris Lee, and Dr. Brian Zid here to answer all your questions. So I'll go ahead and start by asking our panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their work.
So I'm in the chemistry and biochemistry department. I started in 2015. My lab mainly uses yeast that we're trying to expand out to mammalian models, and we look at RNA localization to the mitochondria. And so one of the things I'll probably bring up in my postdoc lab was like this bringing together a bunch of different disciplines was super, I don't know, it was a great experience for me to learn. And my hope is for my lab to do that. And so we try to do computational methods of modeling RNA localization. We use imaging, we use genomics, we use protein biochemistry, trying to bring that all together so that you're not technique limited, but it's really question driven, and whatever technique gets you the answer is the best way to do it. So striving for that, reaching there can be harder sometimes.
Yeah, so I'm actually in the Department of Molecular Biology. I just started my position July 1 of this year, so it's kind of lab still finding its feet per se. But I'm very excited and interested in how protein organization around membranes gives rise to subcellular shape and the consequences of that. My background is interesting because I actually did my PhD in Romeo Amaro and Andy McCann's lab doing largely atomistic simulations. And then as a postdoc, I went up one level in scale and worked with Padmini Rangamani and Mike Holst on multi-scale modeling for membrane mechanics and other kinds of things before I kind of ended up where I am now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zeinab, Jahed. I think whoever was there in the morning heard a little bit about what my lab does. I'm in the Department of Chemical and NanoEngineering, and we build materials and devices that interface with cells to be able to sense intracellular processes. And yeah, my lab is currently focused in two main areas. It's how cells respond to nanoscale surface topography and how this nanoscale surface topography could be used to modulate and manipulate cellular processes. And then on one side, we're building new technologies to be able to detect electrochemical activity inside the cells. So.
Thank you, panelists, for those great introductions. So I think the way we would like to structure this panel is we do have a few starter questions just to kind of get the conversation started. For each of these questions, I'll have the panelists answer, and say if you have maybe follow-up questions, we can take those as well. And then there will also be time at the end just for your own questions. So to start off, we'll want to ask you, why did you decide to pursue academia and academic research? Were you ever interested in a role in industry?
That way this time?
Sure. I definitely did not have a linear path. So my dad was actually a professor, and so I never wanted to be a professor because I just figured there's no money in this job. We were 6 kids living in Iran, and I just thought this job is not very appealing to me because, you know, I want to be independent. I want to make money. So I never really wanted to be a professor until I didn't do any research in my undergrad, and I was looking into industry positions. And my graduation was around the economic crisis where there weren't many jobs, and a lot of people just decided to, you know, do a master's to, you know, just until the economy gets better to look for industry roles. So I started a master's in Canada, and I really fell in love with research then. So I didn't consider myself to be a researcher or enjoy research. So for me, it was just getting into research. The first paper I published, I just realized I loved the feeling of discovery and working on new problems and being able to change what you work on any day that you want. So that was my motivation. And yes, I did think of industry. So the nice thing with my undergrad program in Canada was it's called a cooperative education program. So you have four months of school, 4 months of work. So I had 2.5 years almost of industry experience during my undergrad. So I did consider industry as an option. But when I started my research in my master's, then I just wanted to stay in academia.
So my path was also not very linear. Effectively, I started doing research because I wanted to design drugs and things like that. At that time, kind of the senior undergraduate biochemistry lab, I got an enzyme kinetics and other kinds of things. Partially, I worked on the side with free energy perturbations for molecule affinities and other predictions like that. And that kind of got me interested in, can I apply these skills directly in a company somewhere? And when I started to apply for jobs, basically folks were like, as an undergrad, you don't have enough skills for this. You need to do some more advanced training. And so it turns out that I think a lot of the problems that I was interested in required additional efforts. And so I pursued grad school. And then came the question of like, what do I do? So at that time, it was like, there were a lot of very nice drug discovery companies that were hiring, or do I continue to do a postdoc? And at this point, my interests had become diverse enough that I had, enough academic curiosities, some problems that I really wanted to tackle that I thought I could make a difference in. So I started, that's what caused me to lean towards the postdoc direction. Also bumped into Pat Meany at a really awesome seminar where she said cell shape matters. And I thought, oh gosh, that's awesome. I really care about that. We should work on this together. In terms of industry, it was something that I thought about quite a bit because there are a lot of challenges behind like compensation that's as a postdoc and what folks in industry will be paying you. And one of the interesting transitions from doing a PhD and then moving on to a postdoc locally is that you actually still have a lot of friends in the area. Friends who will go into industry and make lots of money and then buy houses and do cool things and have stuff. And you have to live with that basically. And so there's always this kind of a balance of, is it worth it for me to stay, or are there other things that I care about? And when you start to see people living real lives, it becomes very real and you have to think about it.
Yeah, my path, I guess, is probably more linear, but I started from very much a place of ignorance. I came from a very small town in southern Missouri, and I didn't know anything about academia. And so I was a chemistry undergrad major because I was like, I could go work at Sigma, but I didn't actually know anything, but I've always been someone that just asks questions constantly. And so once I finally experienced research, I was just like, this is amazing. This is like what I've been wanting my entire life and didn't even know it existed. And so then for me, it was always the next step was, well, what's the most fun thing to do? And I was telling some people at my table, like, I did summer undergraduate research. I was like, this is amazing. And I'm like, oh, they're going to pay me to do this all day in graduate school? I want to do that. And then the same thing with a postdoc. I had a bunch of ideas of like research directions I wanted to pursue. And I'm like, well, what labs could I do that in? And so then I was like, all right, I got to do more research. But I was also realistic that I know being a scientist there's kind of random chance of whether you can actually be a PI or not. And so I was aware if it didn't work out, there's other directions I could go, but I never looked into them, I guess. So.
I should specify.
I have a follow-up question to your guys' experience from academia from the faculty. At what point would you advise postdoc maybe in their career that it is time that they start looking for positions? Because I know that that's not a very straightforward timeline, but I've seen as a graduate student for me, but my fear is that if I go into a postdoc, will I be there for 2 years or will I be there for 8 and can transition to a different role on kind of thing?
And there's no, I mean, I think talking to your PI, my PI, she's very straightforward. She's now president at HHMI, and she very much like, she's helpful, but she's not soft in how she says things. So I've always taken a lot of time, graduate school, long time, postdoc, long time. I've always been doing lots of other things. So I've always had a very good work-life balance, which means everything's taking longer. But so this was in my 4th year of my postdoc. My PI, Erin, was like, what do you want to do? I'm like, I still like research, so I'm thinking probably still be a PI. And she's like, I don't think you're going to get the job you want with the research you're doing right now. I think you should do another postdoc and leave my lab type of things. And so again, this was hard to hear, but it was also, she was being helpful. She's like, all right, let's wrap up what you're working on in the next 6 months, and then you move on to another postdoc and see if you can get an academic job. In the next 6 months, my research transitioned. I thought something was working one way, it ended up being another way, it ended up being a Nature paper. Aaron's like, this is amazing, let's get you a job. It was all like random how that happened. And so it was very hard to say like, oh, after your 4th year, you gotta apply for jobs, otherwise you're never gonna get a job. Because if I would apply then, I wouldn't be at UCSD. I don't know what type of job I would have had. And so I don't think there's a set answer. And so having an open relationship with your PI where hopefully they have your best intent in mind. And so again, it was hard to hear from Erin, but it was also, she was trying to help me however she could, I think is the best way to do it. And there's not going to be a set answer for each person, but you know.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it is very random and it depends on your field. But I also think that you should always keep an eye out for positions. And because you don't know the type of positions that will match like with your skills. So because it is so random, there's sometimes like, it looks like you look at some position and it looks like they've written that description for you. Like, that's how it worked out for me. Cause I was only in 1.5 years almost into my postdoc. And I was like, let me apply for 2 or 3 positions that I will take if I get this year. If it doesn't work out, I'm gonna really apply next year. But in that year, there was this one position which seemed perfect for my background and what I had done. So just always keep an eye out for positions as a postdoc, because that's, I mean, hopefully if you're doing a postdoc, at least you're gonna try the academic route. And I agree always to keep an open mind because it is so random. There's so many, there's so many research institutes, there's so many cool things you could do in industry. So you should always have that as your plan B because it is so random. But I say keep an open mind and just look for positions all the time. Don't wait necessarily for your advisor to tell you to do so.
Yeah, I think it's really good advice. And so I think during the postdoctoral process, I had a lot of conversations with Padmini about like, what's the next metric or goal? And for me, a lot of the times, maybe I didn't tell her, but I thought about them as like, maybe these are kind of, decision points where if I can't succeed in producing a grant or something like that, maybe that's a sign that I should not go in academia or I should go do something else. But I always kind of had a couple of things where I thought would be kind of characteristics that I valued to support my future academic research. They were kind of proving to myself that I could do it. And then in terms of when I applied, we basically had a discussion. A number of papers came out last year that were pretty exciting. And it felt like a lot of pieces of my research portfolio came together. So I had a clear project direction and some things I really wanted to work on. And then it turns out that the UCSD job had all the terms of multi-scale computational biology, so on and so forth. And that was a really good fit. So
a lot of times what I gather, people will use postdocs to go into a neighboring but related sort of different skill set. Like for example, you had gone to similar, you went to a greater scale. How much overlap with your background? Because when you start, you're no longer a student, right? There's an expectation that you will be productive as a postdoc. And so how much overlap should there be? And this is like a hard answer or hard question, I know, but it depends on the PI. But like, if you were to hire a postdoc, how would your own judgment drive that decision?
yeah, so I think in my case, we had basically made an arrangement at the time. I was starting to think about these mesh-based methods largely for protein electrostatics calculations. And then because it turns out geometric meshes are good for representing geometries of all scales, I started to get excited about cell shape and so on. That's when I bumped into Padmini at her seminar. Basically, the discussion that we had there was, she could teach me things about cell shape, and then I can bring some of my expertise in molecular dynamics and small scale things into the lab so that we can kind of work on these, multi-scale problems to some extent. It's good to work on things that are kind of close to what you know, because you do have to be very, very productive, of course, especially if you want to stay in academia. If you venture too far away, then the learning curves could be too great. Maybe you take on too ambitious or project that doesn't work out. You have to be kind of aware of these risks as you go along. That's not to say you shouldn't be ambitious, but there's a personal comfort for how much risk you're willing to take.
I'd say a lot of the basis of how to do science, though, you've learned in graduate school, problem solving, things like that are, to me, the most important things. And yes, I don't know, I was talking to my table again. It was humbling starting my postdoc, and I wasn't that different of genre. I was just going from Drosophila to yeast, but still, you just don't know where anything is in the lab. You don't know how to do this experiment. And so everyone has to learn, and that's great. But still, these bases of like troubleshooting, these things that sometimes it's hard to teach graduate students are the things that are really important. And I think those come. And so, yes, there's definitely a drop where you're kind of slow, but then you accelerate really fast because you've learned a lot of these basic science concepts. And so, I don't know, my postdoc lab would bring in people from very different disciplines. And the person that I collaborated the most with actually has a PhD in condensed matter physics. And we still collaborate to this day. And yes, he had a very steep learning curve. He was pipetting without tips and contaminating his cultures and but he was very smart. He already knew how to do science in a different way. But that was also meant whenever he went on the job market, we were friendly going for jobs at the exact same time. And I got the first interview, and then he got like 10 more because people wanted someone with this diverse skill set as well. And since he came from this physics background while doing kind of genomics, molecular biology, he was in much more demand because he thought differently than a lot of the other people. So I think going across fields, if you can make it, which it can be challenging, can also be great that you differentiate yourself from a lot of other applicants if you're looking to go further.
I agree with everything that was said, and also to add on, if you have the opportunity to do a long postdoc, like if the financial, situation doesn't bother you, or if you don't have those limitations, I would always recommend a longer postdoc, because the postdoc is really the best time of your life. Like you've learned everything, you've done all the troubleshooting in your graduate studies, and then the postdoc is a time where you use someone else's lab without having to set up your own lab, and you can just do impactful research. So I did a short postdoc, and I actually not regret it, but if I went back, I would do a longer postdoc. Because it's the best time you can do the most impactful research, and you don't have to worry about everything that happens, when you start your own lab. So if you do have that advantage to not have to worry about the financial situation as much, because that's the main drawback of doing a postdoc, I think. Then I recommend to do a longer postdoc, and that means that you could be more risk-taking. You could start something completely new, learn it, and then, publish in that area or do very impactful research in that area. But it may take longer. So if you are thinking about, very short postdoc, I think it makes more sense to go somewhere where, you're ready to start when you're ready to do the research when you start your position, and you can produce, good results within the first year or two of your postdoc.
So we touched on this a little bit, same with troubleshooting and balancing breadth and depth in your research. So are there any other qualities or aspects of someone who might succeed in your academic environment?
I think you should be very open to failure. I mean, for many jobs, this is true, but for academia, like you might see PIs, they're getting all these big grants, but behind every grant that is awarded, it's like 10 grants that you wrote and you got rejections for, and papers that you got rejections. So I think being very accepting of failure is one, I think, characteristic that you need as someone to succeed in academia, because in industry you could do very similar research without worrying about all this instability in funding. And yeah.
So I think I got some really good advice when I was a postdoc about being excellent at executing and completing projects. And oftentimes this is a challenging thing because, we're scientists, we love ideas. We go to a conference and there's 10 new ideas that we write down in our notebooks, and they're all exciting and fun. But at the same time, one has to prioritize, which turns out to be extremely important in practice, because when you become a PI, you have to make tons of decisions all the time. Being able to, figure out which ones are the most important, execute, complete the paper, write the grants, so on and so forth, I think is one of the most important skills that you can develop.
So related to this, things going wrong, for me, my brain doesn't turn off with science. I wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm like, oh, we didn't run this control. And that's why this experiment of my grad student didn't work. But so for me, it was very important to play a lot of Frisbee, basketball. As a grad student, I went to a bunch of concerts. I went out with friends. And that there's multiple ways you can succeed, and you don't have to be, for me, my brain is just focused on science because I love it, but doing other things allows me to be okay when things aren't working, or you can't figure out for 3 months why troubleshooting something is not working. It's so frustrating, but having other things can help with that. And I had a lot of friends that were very social, who were professors at Berkeley, Colorado, Mount Sinai, and a lot of friends that we would try to get out and were less social, but seemed to be more focused, and they got burnt out from science. And there was a guy that was very focused, he's chair of chemistry at Harvard now. So there is different routes to take. But for me, I think I needed that doing lots of other things, I've always been excited about science and never been burnt out. And I think a lot of that is because I have this balance, so that when things are bad, I have other things to occupy my mind. My mind turns off when I'm playing sports, essentially, and that's very important for me.
Are there other ways in which you keep that balance?
Yeah, I run marathons, so that's the only way that I have some wins on the side. I plan for, the next marathon I'm gonna run, so sometimes when work isn't going so well, I'm like, oh, at least, I'm gonna finish this and I'm gonna get that medal. So sports, I think that's the way out.
I feel like it flushes the brain of like, whatever those chemicals of that feeling whenever something fails, a grant rejection nowadays, or like things like that. It's just super helpful.
Yeah, sports at times, and then I like to have a lot of kind of mechanical projects, so maybe bike fixing or construction activities and things. For me, it's always nice to see something materialize at the end of the day. Where if you sit and you code a bunch, then it's just like a couple more bits in this file arbitrarily. But if you go home and you build a wall, then it's there, you can see it, you can touch it, and it feels like you've made some progress, and it's a good reminder that you're actually doing useful things in your research as well.
And then family helps too. I go home to a 2-year-old who's super cute, so it helps a lot.
Touching on the grants a little bit. So how do you all decide which grants to apply for and prioritize the ones that will benefit the most? We have the best chance at, high risk, high reward, right?
Yeah, I feel like this is something I'm still learning. When I started, I just, wrote grants everywhere. I submitted everywhere, but you kind of burn out and you just don't have the time to do that anymore. So at least I think for the first few years, aiming at young investigator grants is a good idea. I don't know how.
Yeah, I kind of got turned off from the foundational grants because there's not much rhyme or reason with the actual NSF NIH grants, but you at least get some feedback of what you should do different. In the foundational grants, I kind of just like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just gonna stop because, wasn't getting them, and then I didn't know what I should be doing different. So just focusing on NIH NSF grants now. And the thing that I felt like I should have maybe transitioned earlier was I had like NIGMS money through the MIRA, and that I should have been branching out to try and hit other institutes earlier. And so trying to branch out your research portfolio so that you are attractive to other funding agencies. And I think I wasn't actively trying to do that initially, and then now I am, and it's working, but I should have done that earlier, I guess, in the process.
Yeah, I don't think I have a clear grant writing strategy at this point. Again, there's some lists out there of young investigator type awards that I kind of investigated those, and then largely networking and talking to folks who have done the process to try to learn about opportunities that I could be considering. And then also learning some of the details of the specific things that certain committees really care about. I think the more you can understand the criteria, and if you're a good match for the criteria you're looking for, then you can kind of optimize some of your efforts, because there's so much wealth of information around. It's just a matter of finding the right people.
On the grants, did you find it difficult to transition from being in the lab and doing all the experiments with your hands into more of a like writing and coming up with ideas and not so much doing the experiments yourself? Was that difficult to do?
I missed the experiments, and the hard thing is also, you're coming out of your postdoc. Remember, you're the most efficient you're probably ever gonna be at doing experiments. And then you're training first year graduate students to do the same things, and it can be very hard whenever it's something that you could do, but you need them to learn long term, because then you also, at some point, you have too many students and you can't be in the lab. But that's a very challenging thing to transition to. Where the grant writing, even though I get rejected a lot, I still find fun, because it's like, let's come up with ideas of cool science that you can do. The frustrating thing is that the stuff that I'm most excited about is getting killed, and the stuff that's getting funded is stuff that I'm excited about, but it's not like this dream stuff that I have. And just, again, there's just so much randomness at every step and every level in science. That's, I would say, the most frustrating part.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah, so I think changing to the PI life is quite interesting. It happened quite recently for me, and it, you know, the independence of it, I think, is much more than I had anticipated, in the sense that, you know, they give you some empty offices, and I'm at the same institution, but now there's different department politics, and there's kind of all these decisions to be made about exactly what do I spend my time on. There's, you know, no boss per se. And now it's like I have to make all of these decisions all of the time, and, you know, develop my core research direction and so on. I think, yeah, that's probably the biggest thing.
And I guess along with that question is like, how do you decide that's what you want to do? How do you decide you want to go with writing grants instead of being like a staff scientist?
That's an important thing to think about too, because the jobs are completely different. Yeah, I rarely get to do actual experiments. It's just trying to get my students to present their data in a way where I can actually understand it and be able to help. It's very different from what I did as a postdoc or grad student. But one thing you could do as a postdoc to kind of train for it a little bit is to delegate some tasks. I mean, you probably work with master's students or even PhD students as a postdoc. So you can kind of transition into that role of delegating the experiments to those students while you're maybe working on a grant as a postdoc. Going back to the long postdoc that I was talking about that I regret I didn't do, is that you had that time towards the end to really focus on grant writing. And maybe get help from your PI, and already you figure out all the young investigator grants and all the postdoc transitional grants. It's just, I know my colleagues who came in with that background, with a 5-6 year postdoc, and were already written the grants before they started their positions, are, you know, the ones who got those grants. But to decide whether you want to be a PI, was that the question?
Yeah, like
That's a very
yes,
philosophical
no.
question. Like as you were saying, like, it's partly your decision, and then the fact that it's a random, you know, job market. So it's if you want to do research and you want to be like a senior researcher, there's many opportunities to do that, even if not as a PI. But as a PI, your main task is coming up with ideas and writing grants. That's, I think, I would say the most important thing that we do. And then obviously mentoring students and working with students. So that's the main job.
Personally, I don't know if I'd like a boss. I haven't really had a boss, even my postdoc, whatever she said, but I was still the one choosing what I was working on, what ideas I would pursue. And I guess that's my personality, likes that a lot. So now again, there is no boss. I choose everything of what I do. And yes, I need to get funding for it. So the NIH is kind of my overlord, but like, I'm still the one deciding, well, this is a super interesting idea. I want to go this direction. And that's amazing that I get to come up with questions and I get to try and find answers that no one knows.
Well, if you get bored, you can just stop that project.
Yeah.
It's not like you're married to it. Yeah, you can just, you know, break up with the project whenever you want.
Yeah, there really is a tremendous amount of freedom. You get to pick pretty much everything, from the furniture to all kinds. Who do you want to be the first staff in your group? On. So you have really a lot of flexibility. It's a lot like a startup company without the kind of the potential financial benefits, I guess. But you do get a lot of creativity in what you do.
So going back to the grant question, my question is more, how do you encourage graduate students to apply for grants? mentor younger graduate students, and oftentimes the government grants don't pay extra money, so there's this sentiment of, should I even apply for a grant? It's a lot of work if I'm not going to get extra money. And I feel like I've exhausted this will look great for your CV. You can advertise to people that you invite. So how would you advise your graduate students or other graduate students coming in? Why grants?
I think for me and my students, it depends what their career trajectory is. If they are interested in academia, I push it more. And again, I try to recruit people who are passionate, and I explain to them the same way why I like writing grants. I'm not very necessarily good at it naturally, but I like writing it because you get to come up with the ideas. Do you have any questions in mind that you don't know the answer to? And just trying to put those ideas down on paper, and it's a skill that, like everything, you can improve. And so if you're gonna keep doing this, you want to get better at it, whether you get more money or not. Like this is, you're thinking of academia, this is what you have to do and you have to get better at it to survive. So you might as well start as early as possible. But yeah, like everything, for me, it should be a fun part of science. Reading, looking into the papers, delving into literature, finding to generate new ideas. If that's not fun, then maybe academia is not the right direction for it too. So that's an important thing for you to figure out, or for the student to figure out as a graduate student. If that's not enjoyable, then yeah, then academia is going to be very hard.
Do you have any colleagues from your PhD or postdoc or any time, like, part of your career that are making lots of money, like that didn't end up going through academia?
Yes.
Almost like 70% of the lab, I would say, every like postdoc lab that we're in. I don't know, from my experience, 70% of the people don't go to academia.
Yeah, but-
They make a lot of money.
Very good friend, graduate student, but he lives on a boat down in Florida, and like he presses a button every so often to write code for, he was a aerospace major at Caltech, and he writes code for Wall Street type of stuff. And so like, they'll just go sail for 6 months and then press a couple buttons and go sail some more and ride his motorcycle across America. But he also still misses academia some too. I mean, there's
The truth is that just what he's telling.
no, he's an adjunct professor position, like, yeah. So, I don't know why he's an interesting guy.
I'm glad you mentioned the kind of different parts of academia, as a professor, for example. So I feel like in this discussion, we've been kind of lumping academia in one kind of thing, which is basically PI. At primarily research-based institutions, when we were talking a little bit at lunch. So what made you go this route compared to other institutions which might emphasize, for example, teaching or service more?
I mean, I guess y'all kind of alluded to it. It's just the excitement for research more than anything. And mentorship, of course, because we do both, but the research is at least what drives me to want to be in academia. So that's why I think first consider any of those options. That's what I saw.
So for me, basically the same thing is I felt that, you know, the coolest part of the job was the creativity that I can bring to the research and the research directions that I'm excited about. You know, are there other schools? Certainly, but I felt that at the time, you know, I have a 2-body problem. If I were to force my partner to move somewhere else for a PUI job that I was informed about, I didn't feel that that was like a respectful thing to do. And so basically, you know, those were kind of off the table, but I essentially created some pros and cons lists of all the different things and thought, do they fit with the lifestyle that I want with my family circumstance, everything else, so on and so forth. And basically it came down to go for as big of a research place as I could get, or possibly industry.
I'm from a liberal arts and sciences undergrad, and I loved it as an undergrad. It's like 6,000, smaller undergrad. But the teaching, and I like teaching here, but I don't teach that much. And you're still encouraged to do research, and that seems stressful to me. Like the 10 weeks that I teach my undergrad and grad class together, I I have to be a hyper efficiency, and I wouldn't like being that for year round. Where for that 10 weeks, I can do it. I know it's short term. I enjoy the teaching. I love the feedback I get from the students. But if I was supposed to be teaching 2 classes a semester and trying to do research, I feel like I would get stressed out by that and it wouldn't be as enjoyable for me. Where this is, I enjoy it as well.
So on that, I know we mentioned filtering out kind of these primarily research-based roles. What other things did you look for in your search for academic positions? And
A job. And then just getting that
I didn't want to say
offer
it, but
is the main thing. And then, yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, so I think, but in my application round, I discussed with Padmini that it would be kind of the reach schools per se. In that set, and basically I compiled a list of schools that I thought had sufficient industry to support the partners, roles, so on and so forth, and that narrowed things down quite a bit. And then from that, universities that had certain resources of things that I would care about, so I don't have to work with other universities for certain data sets or otherwise. And that basically kind of led to the final list that I applied to.
Yeah, also for me, I think, again, I would have chosen industry over a place I did not want to move to, or a position that I didn't want just to be in academia. So I always had my plan, A was California, for our one institution, and then, or really industry in California. So I had a 2-body problem as well, and my partner had lived in like East Coast for a very long time and did not want to move back to the cold. So I really wanted to stay in California. So it was, the option was either one of the universities in California or a research institute or industry, because there are amazing positions now. Like Meta has, the Chen Zuckerberg initiative. They're hiring PIs. But you can hire postdocs, postdocs, and do the same research that is done in academia. So there are very cool positions in the industry that are very similar to academia, except we just don't have the funding issues, and you don't have the graduate students. So there are very good opportunities. For me, it was, that was my plan. And yes, finding a job really, and becoming stable, and then also being able to be completely independent. Those were the motivations for me to apply for positions. Yeah.
so you do have the jobs now. Congratulations. So, with academia, you see a lot of people kind of staying in the same place at the same university for a very long time. Do you feel that pressure? Do you ever foresee yourself maybe, I don't mean to do this in front of Dr. McCullough, but I don't know, potentially maybe going to another institution, or even, like you said, an industry institution or research institute?
For me, I don't see that ever happening unless my wife got some dream job somewhere else. That's the only thing. San Diego's paradise. To me, I love the environment. Like, it's top tier science, but it's super laid back. And like, I run this RNA club, and there's mitochondrial club, and there's just all this unpublished data, people talking, bouncing around ideas, which is what I think science should be. And then again, 5 beaches 15 minutes away, traffic's not too bad. It's like amazing place to raise kids. Like, I'm very happy here, and I wouldn't leave again unless my wife had some dream job, and then that would be the only reason I would do it.
Sorry, let me rephrase this to make it less personalized. Have you heard of instances where, say, colleagues needed help with that transition, say they didn't mesh with the department, or they wanted to switch fields, or things like that? And do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting, tricky question. So there's all kinds of things that can happen. So I know a few folks who didn't end up getting tenure due to department politics or otherwise. Some of them stayed on as kind of senior scientists and working in others' labs. Others moved to other universities. Usually, I think in all the cases, basically, They reached out to postdoctoral and other senior advisors who they respected to try to figure out what works for your situation. I think you almost have to be very personal in this case, is because at some point you will have things in your life, some circumstance, partner, material things, otherwise, that are going to constrain you, and you have to think about it in a very holistic picture, even beyond research to some extent. As Brian was saying, research is one of the most important things, but at the same time, there's also a lot of other things in your life that are going to continue happening, and you have to find the balance and protect what you care about.
Yeah, I think this comes back to when you're, accepting a position. I mean, know your value, because especially if you have multiple offers, you really want to look into the departments and what their culture is, what do they value in a researcher. So before choosing a department, yes, you want stability, you want the job, but also think about your value. Like you can decide which department to go in, and if nothing's working for you this year, like you still have options to apply the year after. So don't just take the job because they're giving it to you, because there are departments which the politics are not great, and they don't value the same things that you might, so that can raise issues later on. And sometimes it's really hard to know before you join a department what the politics are, but these are real issues that people deal with. So again, know your values and don't just take a job because they're giving you the job. And in academia, it seems like more people will do that because it's such a, again, hard job to get, a difficult job to get. Yeah.
So I have a question, a little bit off topic from the academic. But being a student, so I'm not writing or here in the biological sciences program, and we're trying to do our best to get connected with industry, specifically here in San Diego, since we have such a great biotech lab. How have you seen the sentiment change since when you were in graduate school to right now with industry? What are you doing as a professor with your students or exploring other things?
I think whenever I was a grad student, it was almost talked down of going to industry, of like, oh, that's like a second tier thing. And I feel like at CSD, I hope that's not how it is. Because yeah, it's just, you want to find where you're going to be happiest. That's in academia, that's in industry, that's in public policy, teaching, whatever. You've got to find what that is. And so personally, like I run this RNA club, we try to bring in industry speakers. There's connections with Ionis. There's GNOW has a nonprofit where a lot of the RNA industry connect with academia. And so we try to run joint events with them so the students can go and meet people in industry. And for me, it's also, I didn't know anyone in industry. And so it's also like an enlightening thing for me to just talk with people, meet people. So that's something we try to do, because it's also a recruitment tool for future graduate students, that San Diego is this great place for biotech, and we have these connections. And so whenever my students graduate, I want to make sure they're getting the job they want. So having these connections helps me better place my students in the jobs they want. So even if I'm not interested in industry, I want to help my students however I can. And so by having some of these connections, that's helpful for me in my lab long term.
Yeah, so as a graduate student in the Mara and McKinnon labs, which are largely computer-aided drug discovery focused, I think there's a lot of natural connections with industry. So actually, as a number of the folks at that time did like summer internships at companies that were supported. Like you take a leave of absence for a bit, you can go back. I think that what's important about these things is to be super clear, maybe way in advance with your advisor, because from the PI's perspective, you have to produce a certain amount of preliminary data, get grants, do all these things. All these pieces have to mesh like perfectly, and you have to get really lucky to actually get the funding. There's all kinds of random circumstances that we've been alluding at. And if all of a sudden you may not get a certain data or something, you have to scramble to address these things. And that's kind of scary. And so I think the more clear you are with it, the more likely it is to be able to work something out. And again, if you're clear with your advisor, hopefully they'd be supportive of it. I think my perspective on it is that I would hope that the students are pretty clear with me about where they want to go, and I would try to help them to whatever position they want.
And so, let's end on a great note. So just one last question. So what is your favorite part of your academic job that is unique to academia that you can't get in, say, another kind of field?
And I brought this up before, but it's like the same thing that's driven me since I was a kid. Like, I have a question, and that at some point books didn't have the answers, and then I was very surprised the teachers didn't have the answers, and that there's not a lot of people, we don't have the answers to a lot of questions. And that I can go out and I can come up with any question that I'm interested in, and I can try to find the answer that no one else knows. And that's, to me, the most amazing thing about science. And that I don't have a boss or someone saying, you can't go this direction because you're not gonna make money off of it. I don't care. I studied aging in graduate school, but it wasn't necessarily so altruistic. I just thought it was a super interesting question of why any organism ages. And so while my discoveries may help people, that's not what drives me. And so I'm driven by just very basic inquisitiveness. And I think that can't do necessarily anywhere else besides in
I think the most exciting thing for me is the opportunity to build a team of folks who I think are doing exciting things and can add value to whatever directions that I'm excited about. So again, to address the specific research questions that I think are cool.
Yeah, for me too. I think Chris mentioned like running a lab is kind of like having a startup. But when you start a company with a product and goal, and with developing a product, you're kind of stuck with that product. And really, you just have to make the best of that product to be able to sell it so your company can survive. With this lab startup, with our kind of startup, you can pivot as many times as you want, and you can have these like small startups come up every year. Like we just founded a company last week on one of our projects. So I can found that company and then work on that idea for a little bit and let someone else run it if I want to, and then just work on a parallel project the next day. Like you can have this startup where you're not bound to your product, and you can, develop technology, you can answer questions, you can do all these things within that lab. You can change your team if there's, issues with your team. Just so much more flexible. It will never become the billion-dollar company, yes, but you can work on so many different things within this structure of a lab. So that's what I love about academia. It's the flexibility and of developing new technologies and answers to questions that no one has answered.
you can make these amazing discoveries. In grad school, we were just trying to make flies live longer. And we found that like, if you inhibit this TOR pathway, they live longer. And now rapamycin, mTOR is like this such a billion-dollar potential industry. And we were one of the first people to ever show this. And that's just amazing. And it was just because we were like, look, can we make these flies grow longer if we slow a growth pathway? Which wasn't intuitive at the time that it would do anything.
Yeah, there's so many examples of that, like, oh, how can bacteria protect themselves against viruses? And there's like, gene editing technology coming out of that. So yeah, it's just really cool to answer questions where you don't have to tell someone, oh, this is why I want to answer this question. It's just because we don't know. Don't you want to know?
Yeah, that's so inspiring. You get all that flexibility and then you can have these great discoveries that just spur. Let's open up to the floor for anyone who wants to ask a question that maybe hasn't been covered yet.
Since there's a kind of variety on the panel, what are the pros and cons you think of staying at the same institution for all your different positions versus going to different places? Like for undergrad, grad, postdoc.
It's a huge risk. So if you choose to stay, for example, I did UCSD the whole time, you be prepared to justify it, and I justify it every day. So when the department chair emails me, they ask me, why are you different than Romy and Padmini? And I have to, answer these questions every day in my research. So it's free, but there's still some political and other constraints that you have to deal with. You'll find that for fellowships and otherwise. At the same time, I knew that for the types of research I wanted to do, that, from Padmini's papers, that she was thinking about the kinds of problems that I absolutely wanted to work on. And so to me, there was kind of no question that, I looked around and this is the lab that I wanted to train in. So that's what formed my decision.
I don't know why there is this need that you have to jump from one coast to the other. I did it, but I don't see why it's needed. So hopefully over time that can diminish and it's just go where you think you can do your best science and get hired where you can do your best science. But
Yeah, I moved a lot too, and I think by the moves themselves teach you a lot because research is done differently at different institutes. And the other thing is you build a bigger network. So just by like being at Stanford, being at Berkeley, I just had this huge network of people in industry and like in different areas that, for example, can be the people that my students go to. So part of it just, I think the only advantage would be building a bigger network that is distributed, but again, I don't see any, like labs work very differently in the same institute as well. So moving from one lab to the other, you can learn a lot about research, but just maybe the network aspect of it, I think, is helpful to move and to network with more people. But yeah, that's like private schools are very different from public schools. These are little things that you learn when you move between these schools.
medical schools, even at the same campus, are very different from non-medical schools.
Earlier.
Yeah, I just want to circle back to education. What I've kind of noticed is there's a phenomenon of like really excellent research done at like these top 10, top 20 well-funded schools for research. But not everyone who goes to those schools ultimately wants to end up having their own lab and their own interest in education. But the education that they receive at universities that are more well-funded, they have less like hands-on support, and education is more inferior compared to like a smaller, maybe liberal arts school where they can dedicate education. And I feel like as a PI, so much of your role is education, and so to lose that, you're losing the ability to spark interest in people who are just starting to grasp these concepts. So like, I guess my just general question to you is that if university tells you you need to teach something, are you genuinely excited about it, or you're like, oh, this is a burden? Because I do feel like there's a culture where like teaching is not what they would rather do, and it reflects in what the students learn.
I mean, so whenever I was interviewing here at the end, they're like, oh, what could you teach? And I said, oh, I could teach intro chemistry. And they're like, you want to teach that? Yeah, you can do that, because it's like this intro service course. But again, that's what got me excited about science to begin with. And so I believe I convey that excitement to my students. And I do think it helps a lot. And so I have always been able to, well, again, because this is a course that maybe a lot of people don't want to teach, I've always been able to choose to teach this course. And I think going forward, if I had to teach another course, I would get to choose something like, my thoughts are teaching like a laboratory course where I can integrate some of what we do in my lab with a course, again, because I would be excited about doing it. I don't want to teach something, to me, it's a lot of time, and I don't want to be teaching something that is cumbersome or boring or that I don't want to be there for. I would figure out some way to teach something else that I actually enjoy. Yeah, I don't know, that's just every aspect of my life. I want it to be something that I enjoy doing. And if it's, I've been lucky that that's how it's been able to be. I think some people get stuck in things, and I've been privileged and lucky for that to not happen to me at least.
So I haven't taught anything yet, so my opinions are a bit biased probably. But I'm actually quite enthusiastic to teach the classes, whatever is assigned to me, basically. Because you get to put your own spin on it. And so I think there's a lot of aspects in biology education where there's not a lot of traditional computational focus. And in certain areas I think are important that, maybe others don't think about, but that's the cool part of having your own classes. You get to put your own spin on it. And my hope is that because I've, worked with some folks in industry and otherwise, that I have some perspectives that may be unique, and hopefully they can inspire someone to do good things in their longer term career. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, for me too, I think one of the reasons we talked about why we love academia and research and all that, but why I wanted to do it in academia versus industry, but because as I mentioned, you could do very similar research there, is because I love the teaching and mentorship aspect. In my graduate studies, I did a lot of mentorship and a lot of teaching. So I really love that aspect of it. And for me too, I've been lucky that our department has allowed me to teach the courses I want to teach. I'm in the chemical and nanoengineering department. I'm teaching the statistics course because that's what I love to teach, and the biochemistry course. So I've been able to select what I want to teach. But it is true that in many departments, there's, sometimes you have to teach any course that you're given, and I can see how that would reflect. I mean, I don't know, if the professor has many things to do and they have to teach something that they're not excited about, it might be difficult. So that's something maybe you want to negotiate or talk about before joining a department. But then I agree with you that like we should enjoy the job and everything should be happy, but at the end of the day, it is also a job. So it's not like every day we wake up and we're like, I'm so excited to do everything that I have to do today, which is a list of 1,000 things. And teaching sometimes when it's in the middle of the quarter and there's so many grants, so many projects, and there's teaching, even though you love it, it's just maybe there are some days that you can't reflect that love or excitement about teaching because you're just exhausted out of the many things. That's the honest answer. Like at the end of the day, it is a job. So any job, you're not going to love every single aspect of it every day. But I think the academic job still, most of the time, you love what you do. And again, if I was given a course that I don't like to teach, I don't know how I would feel about it. It hasn't happened to me yet, but it can happen if there's few instructors, someone goes on leave, like you might have to teach courses that you're not very excited about. And yeah, I think that's less of a problem in undergrad research, in schools where research is not the main focus.
We're wrapping here. I think we just had one last question over here.
So thank you for your time, by the way. It's really nice to hear your insight. I guess, I'm a new postdoc with brand spanking when I started last week. I was just wondering, with the role you're in now, what advice would you give to your postdoc self?
Hard to say, yeah. I think there's a lot of things in hindsight that I wish I did as a postdoc that I didn't do, for example. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty in the postdoctoral position and whether you'll even get a job where you want it, if you'll even accept it. So it was very hard to predict, but I think, if I knew that I was already going to get the job, then I would have started like looking and following students' trajectories in grad school, because then I would be able to hire them as a postdoc or do other cool things that I never even thought about because I was so like singly focused on what I was working on. But I think finding some balance between like executing your own work and making sure you're staying broad enough and paying attention to the community is important. But I think, if you can prioritize the things that you care about and understand your own values, then it makes a lot of these decisions a lot easier because they're just so abstract that it can feel really daunting.
Well, thank you to our panelists for their time and their insights. So I think we're gonna go ahead and transition to our next session. Which will. Are you gonna move the yeah, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jessie Meyer.